Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking some absolutely paradigm-shifting research by geopolitics researcher Salar Seif. We're looking at one of the world's most critical maritime arteries through a totally new lens. If you've ever wondered why a conflict halfway across the globe can suddenly spike your local gas prices, you'll definitely want to stick around for this. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been, well, heavily mythologized. It's basically been viewed as the ultimate existential weapon, a geopolitical trump card that, if played, would bring global energy markets to a catastrophic halt. But is that actually true anymore? The research we're diving into poses a really provocative question. Is the world's most famous and maybe most dangerous choke point actually losing its edge? Seif's analysis suggests our whole mental model for this waterway might be entirely outdated. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's breakdown. We'll start with the Hormuz deterrent myth, then look at the anatomy of a crisis, the erosion of geopolitical code, the confusion of functions, new risks, and finally, the future of the lever. Starting off with Section 1, the Hormuz deterrent myth, transitioning from an ultimate weapon to a negotiating tactic. So the traditional view held that this strait was a foundational pillar of security doctrine, basically a fail-safe deterrent against military aggression. But Seif's research argues that's just no longer the case. Instead, we need to view it merely as a tool of geopolitical pressure. And like any pressure tool, pulling this lever comes with some strict structural constraints. It brings asymmetric costs to third parties, and crucially, it suffers from diminishing returns over time. In short, it's a lever, not some impenetrable shield. Moving on to Section 2, the anatomy of a crisis, where we'll track the market shock from March to June. Let's move to the timeline and see how this actually builds. Things really kicked off following U.S.-Israeli aggression in late February, which led to a massive peak crisis in March, where the strait was essentially closed off. By April, we started seeing a dramatic drop in global reserves. Then in May, following an Iran-U.S. memorandum, the strait experienced a reopening phase. But the peace didn't last long, right? Because by mid-June, tension abruptly returned, driven by new regional flashpoints. This specific cycle of closing, then negotiating, then reopening is exactly the dataset Seif uses to prove his theory. And let's just look at the sheer scale of the initial economic shock in March. During the peak of that crisis, ship traffic, which normally sees something like 120 to 140 ships a day, dropped to a near standstill. As a direct result, Brent crude spiked to a staggering $126 a barrel. This was a massive, immediate reaction from a market that was suddenly terrified of being cut off from one of its most vital supply routes. The ripple effects of that spike were historic. Just look at this number, 163 million. Between March and May, OECD member countries saw their oil reserves drop by 163 million barrels. To put that into perspective for you, reserves hit their lowest levels since 1990. During this window, crude oil outflow from the Persian Gulf plummeted to around just 2 million barrels per day. The lever was pulled and the global energy buffer took an absolute beating. But here is where the story gets really fascinating. In March, we had that terrifying peak of $126 a barrel. Yet by May, following that Iran-U.S. memorandum we mentioned, tanker traffic resumed and prices plummeted right back down to the $70 range. The market stabilized remarkably fast. The crisis itself was incredibly intense, sure, but the global market's recovery was surprisingly swift. Which brings us to Section 3, erosion of geopolitical code, or what happens when the exceptional becomes routine. To explain this rapid recovery, Seif introduces a brilliant theoretical framework called the erosion of the geopolitical code. Basically, this happens when an action that used to be considered a point of no return, like, say, blockading Hormuz, becomes routine. Think about it. If a geopolitical actor repeatedly uses this pattern of closing, negotiating, and reopening, the international community stops seeing it as the end of the world. Instead, they just expect that any closure will eventually end in some sort of political settlement. So the market actually prices in the predictability of a compromise, and that inherently diminishes the credibility and the shock value of the original threat. That perfectly sets up Section 4, a confusion of functions, dealing with mixed signals and spooked markets. Now, you might be wondering, if the lever is already losing its edge through overuse, what happens when the reasons for pulling it become unpredictable? Well, in mid-June, attacks on commercial vessels and renewed closures weren't actually in response to a direct existential threat against Iran. Instead, according to the research, they were tied to ceasefire violations involving Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And this brilliantly illustrates how mixed signals create chaos. We're seeing two distinct functions here. On the left, using the strait for direct, calculated bargaining with the US, but on the right, using it as a tool for ideological solidarity with regional allies. Blurring these lines makes behavior wildly unpredictable. If you're a dependent third party, this functional ambiguity makes relying on this waterway a massive, massive geopolitical risk. Let's look at the fallout in Section 5, New Risks, specifically the unintended consequences of overuse. The research outlines some pretty severe unintended consequences to this strategy of overuse. First off, tying the strait to regional conflicts invites Western countermeasures, like those UK and French plans for multinational maritime coalitions. It essentially takes a regional issue and forces it into a collective global agenda. Second, it literally terrifies major energy consumers into finding new partners. For example, during this period, Middle East oil exports to China saw a massive 28% decrease. We're talking a staggering drop of 581 million barrels. To survive a shock like that, China aggressively utilized its domestic coal and tapped heavily into its strategic reserves as alternative energy buffers. And this leads to a really fascinating dynamic with alternative suppliers, specifically Russia. While Russia certainly gains a strategic advantage from these short-term supply disruptions and the resulting higher prices, the research points out they're walking a very dangerous tightrope. Because if these disruptions end up causing a long-term global recession, Russia's own energy market will ultimately suffer. And finally, the third risk. If threats are constantly issued without corresponding gains, foreign actors are naturally going to start doubting the credibility of your other strategic threats. Bringing it all together, in Section 6, the future of the lever and the power of rarity. So the crucial point is perfectly captured in this quote from Salar's Scythe. The durability of any lever depends less on how often it is used than on preserving its credibility and the rarity of its use. It's a pretty profound realization when you think about it. The Strait of Hormuz remains a vastly important geopolitical tool, absolutely. But its true power lies in its rarity. If it's deployed frequently or used for non-existential, disconnected regional conflicts, it runs into strict structural limits. The markets adapt, allies start seeking other partners, and that geopolitical code simply fades away. Which leaves us with this incredibly pressing thought. As nations adapt to the geopolitical noise, and the Strait of Hormuz gradually loses its edge through overuse and market adaptation, what will replace it as the ultimate global deterrent?